Good afternoon, everyone. It is my pleasure to be joining you today, and of course to follow Chairman Nell's. I am looking forward to this. And as Peter said, it's hard to believe I'm 3 years here into my tenure, and great to finally be joining you in person at this esteemed conference that he's worked so hard to put together. Thank you to the Texas Rail Advocates for hosting this event and for inviting me. I want to recognize FRA staffer Melissa Foreman, who's accompanying me here today, as well as Melvin Smith from our Railroad Safety Office as well. And there's so many folks around the room that the Federal Railroad Administration works with, from Amtrak and also to the Southern Rail Commission as well. The Southern Rail Commission via Knox Ross, John Robert Smith has been an example, a good example of how interstate compacts can be an effective tool for projects that encompass multiple states, as a lot of passenger rail projects do. And again, thank you all for attending this conference. I'm here today to talk about FRA's implementation of President Biden's Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and the recent actions our agency has taken to improve freight and passenger rail and preview what's ahead of us in 2024. It's also a good time for me to reflect on my over 3 years at the Federal Railroad Administration this time around, when I joined it on January 20th, day one of the Biden-Harris administration as a deputy administrator before the president nominated me to be administrator. In that time, the Federal Railroad Administration was very much and part of the effort on the rail side to make sure that our rail workers were safe during COVID-19, and also to make sure that the industry needed or got what it needed during those times. Also, during my tenure, experienced the supply chain disruptions, which thankfully have been overcome, but during that time when we experienced it, it was a big topic that we navigated through. Also, during my tenure, the labor management negotiations, which almost resulted in a work stoppage that thank goodness didn't happen, and it definitely brought into sharp focus for the public how important rail is and how bad of a situation it would be if there was a work stoppage. And of course, the February 3rd, 2023 Norfolk Southern East Palestine derailment, of which we are still investigating and eagerly waiting for the National Transportation Safety Board final report to be issued. And of course, the $66 billion bipartisan infrastructure law. So thankful to have been a part of that effort that really started with the American Jobs Plan that President Biden, Vice President Harris rolled out in March of 2021. And then moving on to the bipartisan infrastructure law, or bipartisan infrastructure framework, before we ended up with the bipartisan infrastructure law in November of 2021. Rail, which has historically lacked federal funding, is benefiting greatly from those investments. FRA has announced more than $28 billion and nearly 170 rail projects through the infrastructure law. At the same time, the U.S. Department of Transportation has utilized additional sources of funding like the RAISE program, Reconnecting Communities program, and even more to advance rail projects that improve safety and mobility. And I wanted to share a slide presentation with you as I talk through what I wanted to present. So if we could have those slides, I'd appreciate it. I don't know if I'm supposed to press this. So while that's starting, let me emphasize and what I wanted to start with, which is the strategic goals at the Department of Transportation. Of course, the foundation of the work that we do at the federal government on the transportation side is safety. Economic strength and global competitiveness are key in the programs that we implement. Equity, climate sustainability, transformation, and organizational excellence. And you'll see in my presentation how FRA's programs, how our efforts reflect all these strategic goals that we have at the Department of Transportation. And it's also a good time for me to share with you what an honor it's been for me to work with an extraordinary White House, from the President to Secretary Buttigieg, who's been an incredible advocate for rail and a real true believer in passenger rail, and also to the excellent team I have at the Federal Railroad Administration, especially on the appointee side. My Deputy Administrator, Jennifer Mitchell, Chief Counsel, Allison Ishihara Foltz, my Senior Advisor on Rail Safety, Andrea Wolleber, and our Director of Communications, Dan Griffin. Having that core team of appointees, along with folks in the Secretary's office, like Deputy Secretary Polly Trottenberg and Assistant Secretary, now Acting Under Secretary Christopher Coase, we have a really, really strong team at the Department of Transportation. Now, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, without question, has expanded FRA's mission. It substantially increased FRA's funding and expanded our scope. It emphasized FRA's dual mission on safety and development. We have increased FRA's capacity, which I will discuss more in a moment, and we absolutely, every chance I get, encourage state, regional, and other stakeholders to do the same. We need that to meet the moment on rail. Now, in terms of the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, these numbers, every time I see them, definitely jump out at me, especially relative to the environment that we were in pre-November 2021. $22 billion for Amtrak, $5 billion for the Consolidated Rail Infrastructure and Safety Improvement Program, $3 billion for the Railroad Crossing Elimination Program, $36 billion in total for the overall federal-state partnership program that has a component that's for the Northeast Corridor, as well as a national component. And then $250 million for the Restoration and Enhancement Program. What people overlook sometimes in our bipartisan infrastructure law, and I know this is hard to see on this slide, but we can't forget about the authorized levels of funding that we have for these programs. So it's not just $66 billion. When you look at the authorized levels that we have, in addition to that, which is $36 billion, we're really talking about a universe of $102 billion that Congress has authorized for funding up to. And I have to commend Congress for increasing the funding for the Chrissy program, as well as the federal-state partnership program. That's been very, very helpful. It's also been helpful that the Congress has made sure that our safety and operations budget has been funded at an appropriate level. But at the same time, can't overlook the fiscal 24 budget that thankfully Congress put into law, and we don't have to have the threat of government shutting down hanging over us. But that budget, it was an absolute fight on Amtrak funding, especially in the House of Representatives. We need to make sure that Amtrak has that annual funding level that they need to operate on a daily basis. It's one thing for Amtrak to have that $22 billion through the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. Not any of that money goes to Amtrak's operations. Amtrak still needs that annual budget and needs for Congress to come through, and we don't need to have unnecessary heartburn over what Amtrak gets. That should be taken and accepted and not subject to debate on an annual basis every year, especially at a time when so much is being asked of Amtrak to deliver on that $22 billion program in the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, as well as its numerous projects along the Northeast Corridor. Now, in terms of those programs that we have, it's important to remember that we are putting into action a lot of the infrastructure law investments through FRA's competitive grant programs. We've created a project lifecycle graphic to share what these grant programs fund. So on this chart, you've got systems planning, project development, final design, construction, and operations. And I know for a lot of inexperienced stakeholders, they wondered how our programs match to the project life cycle. And that life cycle also covers the development stage as well as the implementation stages as well. But we've definitely tried to make clear and be transparent and share information on how FRA's numerous BIL grant programs, how they align with the project lifecycle framework that we have. Now, within these project lifecycle steps, of course, we've got subtopics within those two, and the work and the tasks that so many of you do on a daily basis. So project development covers environmental processes, preliminary engineering, also cost estimating, stakeholder agreements, which are so important to have in place in terms of the life cycle of the project. Final design also encompasses final engineering. It also includes the project management plan and right-of-way acquisition. And of course, construction and operation and maintenance are all parts of the project life cycle. Now, in terms of our marquee grant programs, I wanted to lead with the Fed-State Partnership Program, which the President announced in Las Vegas in December of 2022. $8.2 billion for 10 passenger rail projects across the country. The projects that we announced through the program will advance 2 high-speed rail corridors and fund improvements to existing rail corridors. Those investments will help deliver high-speed rail service in the Central Valley of California between Merced and Bakersfield, create a brand new high-speed rail corridor between Las Vegas and Southern California, make major upgrades to existing conventional rail corridors to better connect Northern Virginia and the Southeast, including North Carolina, to the Northeast Corridor, expand and add frequencies on Pennsylvania's Keystone Corridor between Philadelphia and Pittsburgh, extend the Piedmont Corridor in North Carolina North as a part of the higher speed rail connection between Raleigh and Richmond, Virginia, invest in improvements around the Chicago area, including around Union Station as an initial step toward future improvements to the critical Midwest corridors. improve service in places like Maine, Montana, and even Alaska. The next program is the Federal State Partnership Northeast Corridor Program. I want to start by really emphasizing this because people have seen the $24 billion price tag associated with the program and the $16.4 billion that we awarded. I want to make clear that the Northeast Corridor Program reflects decades of work through initiatives such as Connecting NEC 2035, NEC Future. It also included a Northeast Corridor inventory that was definitely the work of the Northeast Corridor Commission that the 2008 Passenger Rail Act authorized. And also it reflects the work of the 8 states and the District of Columbia that are part of the Northeast Corridor Commission. Did not happen overnight. But what that $24 billion addresses are critical needs. Funding that will replace or upgrade major bridges and tunnels, most of which are over 100 years old, including the Baltimore and Potomac Tunnel that got into service under President Grant's presidential term. It will improve tracks, power systems, signals, stations, and more, all of which means faster speeds, reduced travel time, and a more reliable experience for hundreds of thousands of daily riders on America's busiest rail corridor. Examples of the Fed State Northeast Corridor projects moving forward include the $3.8 billion for the Hudson Tunnel, connecting New Jersey and New York. $4.7 billion for that Ulysses S. Grant started Baltimore and Potomac Tunnel. $2 billion to replace the Susquehanna River bridges. More than $800 million to replace the Connecticut River Bridge. And more than $1.2 billion for the East River Tunnel rehabilitation that had been affected by Superstorm Sandy. These investments are really about the next 100 years. They're about the 100-year assets that they are replacing on the Northeast Corridor. They are nothing short of an incredible effort via Amtrak, those 8 states that I mentioned, the District of Columbia, and of course the Federal Railroad Administration. Mega projects that we will make sure are on budget and on time. It's amazing to see those procurements completed and dollars awarded to teams that are now working on delivering so many of those projects. Next, I want to talk about Chrissy selections. I mentioned, and you heard previously, how popular the Chrissy program is and how many stakeholders Chrissy programs and project connect. FRA announced more than $1.4 billion for 70 projects in 35 states in 2023. 3 selections in Texas that I want to highlight. The city of Laredo, which I had a chance to visit in July of 2023, in partnership with the Canadian Pacific, Kansas City Southern Railroad, seeks up to $4 million to enhance grade crossings that I heard about since I came to FRA, or returned to FRA in 2021. Perennial grade crossing issues, block crossings that communities in Laredo have had to experience for decades. We're finally making change on them. The Rio Valley Switching Company aims to upgrade track infrastructure and bridges along a 50-mile corridor. The Texas Northwestern Railway, TNW, has over $7.3 million to modernize its rail infrastructure. Overall, that $1.4 billion, the highest ever awarded under the program. Chrissy selections last year also included several projects that will enhance and expand passenger rail across the country. I want to start with a big project that had been out of service since Hurricane Katrina in 2005, the Gulf Coast corridor connecting New Orleans and Mobile, Alabama. Also, 2 new round trips and 3 new commuter rail round trips on the Richmond to Washington, D.C. corridor for Virginia Railway Express and Amtrak. Also, 2 additional round trips on the Capitol Corridor in California between Sacramento and Roseville. Also, efforts to advance Massachusetts' bold effort on East-West Rail that will enhance and speed up connections between Albany, New York, Springfield, Massachusetts, and Boston, Massachusetts. Next, I want to talk about the Railroad Crossing Elimination Program. I was here in, it's hard to believe, in June of 2023 to make announcements about that, just down the road from here at a BNSF grade crossing in Fort Worth. And also, I went down to Houston to a community where I attended a town hall led by Congresswoman Sylvia Garcia, and also with input from Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee, where I got to see for myself the east end of Houston. Again, an area that for decades had experienced block crossings and issues with rail service on the Union Pacific and BNSF trains that operate in that area. We wanted to make sure that we didn't overlook areas like the east end of Houston, Birmingham, Alabama, Hammond, Indiana, communities that have too long been neglected by past administrations. We need to pay attention to those areas and make sure not to overlook those voices. And I'll give credit to the Class 1 railroads in those areas, Union Pacific, BNSF, and the east end of Houston, in Birmingham, Alabama, Norfolk Southern, in Hammond, Indiana, and Norfolk Southern, who worked with those communities to advance those projects so that those communities can be on the pathway not to experience block crossings, and emergency responders don't have to worry about a railroad or a train blocking their path. Also, in railroad crossing elimination, the state of Texas, very, very successful. City of Amarillo received $8.4 billion to construct a modern multimodal bridge. City of San Antonio received $4.8 million to build a grade-separated road overpass over railroad tracks. The Department of Transportation in Texas selected to receive $19.5 million to remove grade crossings over U.S. Highway 90, where we also partnered with the Federal Highway Administration. Also, the Texas Department of Transportation received that grant that I mentioned for BNSF on the Saginaw Corridor Bonds Ranch Road as well. And as I mentioned, $36 million to the city of Houston to improve grade crossings in the east end of Houston. Those projects are going to improve more than 400 highway rail crossings in communities, big and small, nationwide, helping to reduce the number of collisions and fatalities that occur too often at grade crossings. For the projects building an overpass are underway, that also means preventing block crossings entirely. We received over 150 applications for $2.4 billion in that $570 million program. That points to the oversubscription and the demand out there nationally, not only for the railroad crossing elimination program, but it's also indicative of the interest and the high demand out there for our projects overall. Now, I also want to talk about the corridor identification program. This program is pretty small on the scale of FRA's programs, but is absolutely essential in our overall framework of what we're trying to do at FRA, especially on the passenger rail side, because very much we are creating a pipeline of projects. That project lifecycle that I pointed to earlier, we know that some projects are in different stages of that project lifecycle. We wanted to have a mechanism to encompass all those different projects and where they are in the project lifecycle. You know, California High-Speed Rail, it's a good example of a project that is well under construction. Also, Brightline West, the high-speed rail project that I mentioned earlier, is on the way to construction. But we also have efforts like the I-20 corridor that I know people in this room have worked so hard for so many years laboring to progress that project. But through Corridor ID, now there is a focus, and it also is a pathway to our federal-state partnership program and funding through that program. So the Corridor ID program is the mechanism to develop our national network that are outside of the Northeast Corridor. And also, it's a way for FRA to have a national effort on passenger rail. The Corridor ID produces that project pipeline for the federal-state partnership program that I mentioned earlier. And it also means that the projects that are in the pipeline are going to receive priority in that federal-state partnership program. And I didn't realize there was an animation there. And then for our next slide, I wanted to talk about the 69 corridors that we selected for funding in that. The corridor ID map here that I have, and of course we'll share this presentation with you all, shows the corridors that we selected. In future funding cycles, projects included in the project pipeline are going to receive priority. Can't emphasize that enough. And even at this early stage of the Corridor ID process, sponsors should be focused on building their own capacity, to increase their organizational capacity, and to make sure they have the resources in place to be ready to take on that service sponsor responsibility, which is not a small one. Starting those conversations on governance structure and funding sources, especially for corridors that involve multiple states, is important. Identifying ways to collaborate and coordinate with overlapping corridor sponsors and shared station and terminal areas is also important. And building that collaborative partnership, if Amtrak is your primary partner or another service operator, early in the planning process to develop your service together is important, and I really, really encourage that. We announced those 66 corridors across 44 states last December. Some of those examples of planning and development include the high-speed rail service between Dallas and Houston. It includes the Fort Collins to Pueblo, Colorado corridor with stops in Boulder, Denver, and Colorado Springs. It includes the Phoenix to Tucson, Arizona corridor with multiple daily frequencies between them, and also a connection with Baton Rouge and New Orleans, and new service between Atlanta and Savannah, Atlanta and Nashville, via Memphis and Chattanooga. FRA is excited about the potential of these corridors. We've selected 7 programs in the Southwest, including that high-speed rail corridor that I mentioned, Also, the North Texas Central Council of Governments for the corridor linking to Fort Worth. Also, the Houston and San Antonio spurs from Dallas. The Southern Rail Commission also has worked on that I-20 corridor that I mentioned. The Heartland Flyer service from Texas to Oklahoma and Kansas. I mentioned Arizona and that Phoenix to Tucson corridor. And also, I know what a strong focus Texas has had on the Texas Triangle region. Upon successful completion of those development efforts and other requirements, those projects can be well positioned for future potential funding, as well as the next funding bill and the reauthorization law that is not too far off in the distance, thankfully. As I mentioned, this map, which includes both Fed, state, and corridor ID selections, illustrates FRA's plan for passenger rail development nationwide for new and existing corridors. Now, I want to talk about the Amtrak long-distance study, again, which has drawn an extraordinary level of interest from many parts of the country. We've done meetings in various parts of the country. I attended meetings in Jackson, Mississippi, Missoula, Montana, among others. And that long-distance service study is going to evaluate options for restoring and enhancing intercity passenger rail service. It's going to select preferred options for restoring or enhancing services. It's going to develop a prioritized inventory of capital projects and other actions to restore and enhance services, and develop recommendations for cooperation among Amtrak, local communities, and stakeholders, and also identify federal and non-federal funding sources. So I know there's a lot of high expectations on the long-distance service study. We've been putting a lot of resources into it to complete it this year so that those long-distance services can be well positioned for funding in the future. And again, this is that map that I talked about that combines corridor ID, long distance, and also our selections for a federal-state partnership. Now, I wanted to talk about the development and management of capital projects. FRA has a robust set of guidance documents on this. The intended audience for that guidance is project sponsors, partners, and a wide range of professionals who contribute to the planning, development, and implementation of projects across the country. FRA wants to be transparent in its process. We know that the oversight of railroad capital projects is essential. That means making sure that cost and evaluation of risk are done in a proper method. Also compliance, building that capacity, again, is so important. We have to give the public the confidence they need that the public funds we're using are put to good use. And then on the next slide, I wanted to talk about the things that we're doing within FRA. I know that I've talked about what stakeholders can do on capacity. FRA, when I started on January 20th, 2021, had roughly 850 employees. The pipeline of hiring had slowed considerably. Our passenger rail division in particular, passenger rail and development division in particular, hiring had slowed down considerably to a point where people weren't even being replaced one for one. The hiring had slowed down on the safety side. I made sure on January 20th, 2021 to contact the Human Resources Office, the Office of Administration within FRA, to emphasize how important it was to make sure FRA had the capacity to make sure that we provided the services that our stakeholders expect and the American public expects. We didn't want to have a situation where we did not have the resources to do our job. I'm proud to say at this point in 2024, we have over 1,100 employees, a net gain of 250 employees. And again, these are folks like Melissa Foreman that I mentioned, and others throughout the country. And again, our Railroad Development Office also, we made sure there was a realignment so that they're ready to meet the moment. They can provide the technical assistance you all need, especially on the project side. And we have also made sure, and you'll see this a little bit later, that we have regional offices that you can work with directly and who are accessible to you, who are not working on these projects only in Washington, D.C., but are closer to the projects. At the same time, we've made sure that Amtrak also has the resources it needs so that it is not only advancing its maintenance and operations projects, it is also building for the future. And Amtrak has hired over 3,000 new employees. So again, this points to how the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law is also not only setting up programs, but making sure that the federal government and Amtrak are well positioned to deliver on our projects. And then finally, I wanted to point to our grant calendar. And again, we're being transparent and open with our stakeholders so that you all have the predictability, consistency that you need so that you can plan your efforts. We know that submitting these applications, putting projects together is not an easy endeavor, and it requires a lot of upfront costs, but we want to make sure that we're being transparent in that process. And again, this is FRA's regional map, and those places that border each other, we also work collaboratively to make sure that the technical assistance is smooth and we don't have silos within FRA so that we can be responsive to all your needs. So with that, I'll end my presentation. And again, I can't tell you how much of an exciting time it is to be a part of the Federal Railroad Administration right now, how exciting it is to be a part of this administration that made sure that the California High-Speed Rail project was not stalled or ended. We can't forget that the last administration tried to turn the clock back on the California High-Speed Rail project. They stopped the Hudson Tunnel project from advancing. We made sure that the Hudson Tunnel project that is so essential continued. We made sure that there's a robust passenger rail program for the whole country. We made sure to deliver on freight rail projects across the country. And so I want to make sure that you all know how committed this administration is in this year, 2024, of making sure we can have more services that we know that the public is expecting and eagerly looking forward to. So I look forward to working with all of you in this room to deliver on that promise. Thank you.
Thank you, Administrator Bose. I know we're on tight timing here with you to get you back to DFW, but we did have some questions that came in on cards. If we could answer just one, and then the rest we'll pass on to you. Could you offer any insight on President Biden's recent discussion with Prime Minister Kishida concerning the proposed the Texas High-Speed Rail Initiative, particularly regarding the possibility of connecting Dallas to Houston using Japanese bullet trains? And how does this discussion correspond with the objectives of the FRA in advancing the corridor?
Thank you for that question. As I mentioned, the Corridor ID program is such a great program for efforts like the Dallas to Houston high-speed rail effort. The President and the Prime Minister recognized the progress that that project has made, and it's also reflective of the early stages of that project, the collaboration between the U.S., Texas, and the Japanese government in advancing that. And also on that corridor, we can't overlook the work that the Federal Railroad Administration had put in on the environmental side, and also the rule of particular applicability to make sure that the Japanese technology, Shinkansen technology, that corridor will utilize to make sure that the federal safety standards are designed in a way to make sure those Shinkansen rail cars can operate on that system. So we had already done a lot of work on it. I want to commend Amtrak for working with the Texas Central partners in progressing that project and really seeing potential in it. And I know you're going to hear more about that from Andy Byford. I do want to emphasize that from a federal perspective, we cannot overlook how big of a state that Texas obviously is and how much growth is happening here, especially in the Dallas and Houston metropolitan areas. We always look for opportunities to give people who want to travel between these two metropolitan areas not to just rely on I-45 and not to just have to sit in traffic on I-45. So we want to explore options that are available to give people in Texas, people who want to utilize passenger rail, some available options, and that's what we're exploring.
Thank you. Yeah, I think we're...
Okay. Yeah, I think I have to explain the cut. Thank you all.
I don't want you to miss your flight. Thanks a lot.